Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, shooting you the look of love.
It's a look I don't want. Look away, Cam. Please look away. Avert your eyes, everyone.
Your Zoom camera just turned off.
Everything just turned off just there. It was a traumatic experience for everyone, I think.
And you're talking about Casino Royale 67, I assume.
Of course. It's all we can talk about this week. No,
of course.
We are here celebrating the music of James Bond. This week we just ranked the 27 James Bond title tracks. You can go back and listen to that. It came out earlier this week. A fun discussion. Or certainly I think so.
Yeah. I thought it was okay.
Oh, what a stamp of approval, everyone. Go and check that out.
Right.
Yeah.
No, check it out, people. There's some a wild decision-making on both our parts.
There's something was in the drinking water, I think, and it wasn't a dose of that look of love. It's whatever they were drinking when they made Casino Royale 67, clearly.
Yes, exactly. We were having, like, slow-mo. Is there, like, a pillow fight in that movie? It's like slow-mo with the feathers everywhere.
Yeah, there's some curious choices in that scene, but we won't get into that too much now because we are joined by a very special guest to bring some much needed class and knowledge to the podcast when it comes about the music of James Bond.
Yes, we are joined by Jon Burlingame, journalist, lecturer, but perhaps most importantly, the author of the music of James Bond.
Yes, the book itself is practically the gospel when it comes to the music of James Bond. That's why it's the title of the book. It deserves to be on any Bond fan's shelf if you like music and you love 007. And we thought, seeing as we're celebrating the music of this week, let's bring in the man behind the book. Cam, let's get to the interview. This week on Spy Hard, as you know, we are celebrating the music of James Bond, and frankly, I couldn't think of a better guest than the man sitting across us right now on Zoom. Joining us is renowned author, lecturer, journalist, author of a number of books, including one of my personal favorites, The Music of James Bond. It is Mr. Jon Burlingame. Hello, sir. How are you?
Good day to you both, Scott and Cam. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to see your smiling face from across the world. I have a lot of questions, and I think we really want to get into the meat of why the music of Bond is so special. I think we'll get into that in the conversation. But I want to take us back because I mentioned the book, but you've got countless books we could talk about. You're a man, connected to film scores. You've produced score albums, TV scores, film scores. But go back. Let's go back to your childhood a little bit. Where did that interest in film scores come from? Where did it begin?
I think when you're a kid, and I grew up in the 1960s, which makes me, I guess one can say, old. I loved spy television. I grew up watching The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and Mission Impossible and I Spy and The Wild Wild West and Get Smart and Danger Man, known here in the States as Secret Agent. So all of that stuff appealed to me. But also being musically inclined, I grew up singing in a choir and playing the trumpet for a while. And so I was sort of musically inclined and therefore musically interested. I always loved what was coming over that little tiny speaker in our living room. And then when I started to go to the movies, which was more like mid to late 60s, I discovered Bond almost immediately and just flipped out completely over the score of On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Ooh, that's a good one.
I was a huge fan of OHMSS and bought the album immediately and then did a deep dive, as we would say today, into the entire career of John Barry. Then I was in college in the early 1970s, and I made it my business to find every single John Barry album I could because I just went crazy for this guy's style, and very quickly discovered that he had done other spy films, like, for example, The Ipcress File, and created original and fresh sounds that we weren't hearing otherwise in movie scores. So that my movie score, I guess, fandom really sort of blossomed in the 1970s, and I got a job working on a newspaper in the early 70s, and I covered hard news for I don't know, almost a dozen years before I shifted into entertainment writing. And then when I moved to Los Angeles in '86, started interviewing composers on a regular basis because almost no one else was doing it. There seemed to be so little interest, interestingly enough, in film scores that I kind of made it my special niche out here, and eventually wound up writing for other papers like the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times and other places. And that's what really sort of led me down this road. I wrote the Bond book in 2011. It was published in 2012 in the aftermath of John Barry's death in January of 2011. I had been approached to do a book. By that time I'd written, I guess, 3 books maybe on the topics of film music generally, and I'd gotten to know John in the 1990s and early 2000s. We did a number of interviews together, and I loved the guy. Not only loved his music, I loved him personally. I thought he was just a very special human being. And then since I'd been approached to write the book by one of my publishers, but I'd gone back to see John in 2007, I think it was, to do a big piece about him for Variety, the showbiz trade paper I write for regularly. And I discovered that his memory was fading fast. He actually didn't remember much about that particular period. He couldn't keep his Bond films straight. He wasn't sure which is which. And I thought, this is not going to work. This is never going to work. I can't write a book if John's memory doesn't really fit, if it doesn't work anymore. Then he died in January of 2011. And I thought, I have to pay tribute to this guy in one way or another. And so I went back to the publisher and I said, do you still want this thing? And they said, yes. And luckily, over the course of many years, I'd interviewed virtually every person involved with Bond music. Michael Kamen before he died, Marvin Hamlish before he died. I knew Bill Conti. I'd even interviewed Monty Norman. And of course, I knew David Arnold quite well. And all of these guys. And so I began to put it all together, re-interview other people, and utilizing my contacts here and in London, was able to piece together a lot of the nuts and bolts, the true facts. When did they record? How much music was there? Was there extra music we don't know about? What was the relationship between directors and composers? And so I was able to put the story together in a way that had not previously been done. And I have to say, I'm super proud of the music of James Bond. I really feel like I filled a kind of research hole. I mean, there hadn't been a book like that before I did it. And I'm glad I did it because so many of those folks are not with us now. A bit of a long-winded way of answering your question.
Not at all, not at all. Was there a particular Bond film that was maybe the hardest to uncover sort of the story behind?
Now, that's an interesting question. Well, it probably would be Dr. No, because there was, as I'm sure your listeners know, a serious clash between Monty Norman, the composer of the Dr. No score and credited composer of the James Bond theme, and John Barry, who had come in to beef up the arrangement for the film and for records, and then who then went on to become the composer of 11 subsequent Bond films. These guys told vastly different stories. And over the years, editor Peter Hunt, director Terrence Young, yes, Terrence Young, and others involved had told various stories. And so balancing all that out, trying to narrow in on what the truth was not easy. That was a particular challenge. And if I get the opportunity to go back and do a 3rd edition, which I'd like to do, and I'll be approaching the publisher to do a bit later this year, I might tweak a little bit of that. I might go a little bit farther with some conclusions that I reached. But that was a particularly tough one.
And it's interesting. We actually did an episode recently about the Third Man for its 80th anniversary. And we talked to an author who's written a book about it and chronicling the music of that film could not find a consistent story as to how they wound up with the zither score. So it's interesting that when it comes to these, these soundtracks, these scores for these movies, often the facts get kind of muddled over the time in the telling.
And I must go back and listen to that because I'd certainly be interested to hear what you guys came up with. And that Anton Karas score is now iconic, and still to this day, people say to me, "Oh, I hate that score. It's just so terrible. It's all one. It's all one sound. It's all one style." And yet, I'm sure what Carol Reed was looking for was a kind of atmosphere that he was driving at. And when they discovered Karas, and I guess it was in some restaurant playing, right? That was exactly what Carol Reed wanted, even though a lot of people say to me it doesn't work dramatically. Well, maybe that's not what Carol Reed wanted.
Yeah. And the story as to where it was actually heard and how it happened, that's definitely become very muddy. I'll let Dr. know.
All the more reason to do what I do now, which is to go after the story as soon as possible after the movie is out, try to interview everyone possible connected with it, which, by the way, I did at some length on No Time to Die. I got to everybody involved. And so I have once the hopefully new edition of the book is published, there'll be a lot of fresh material that you've not seen or heard before. And so even though Spectre and No Time to Die are not included in the current edition of the book as it exists, I have hopes that we can do that and sort of fill those gaps. It would be great to have one more edition of the book come out before the next James Bond film.
I like the tie in there. That's a pretty good marketing strategy there as well. There's a hype for Bond. Put the book out. Hey, why not? I mean, I could do a second copy. And just to sort of speak to the book for a second, for those of you who haven't picked up a copy, I would certainly urge you all to go and check it out. I mean, there'll be a link in the show notes below for you to go and buy one if you can find it. It's on my spy shelf above my computer of my spy resource books. So you're right up there with some greats. Let's put it that way. But I had some questions more about like building into your love of Bond themes, and I kind of want to talk about spy themes as well, because even you've mentioned going back to the Third Man there. But let's talk about the stories that are in the book, and I won't spoil too much because I want people to go pick it up. But through the process of doing the research over the years, you've compiled all this stuff. Cam asked sort of what was one of the hardest to get to the bottom of. I'm more curious about what was the most surprising for you. Like, there must have been some sort of secret you learned along the way. You're like, oh man, this is a game changer.
We're talking about, how many? We're talking about 20, almost 25 movies here. There were a number of incidents sort of like that. I loved finding out the details of Michel Legrand's involvement with Never Say Never Again. That, which is fairly controversial within the spy community, I think, because there are just as many people who loathe that score, maybe more so than like the score. And yet, how and why he got involved was a really interesting saga to unspool. I'm trying to think. It was interesting to talk to Eric Serra about the score for GoldenEye, which again is, as I'm sure you know, is a bit controversial in the Bond community. There are those who hate it, and there are those who think it was a really interesting departure and something fresh for the Bond franchise in the 90s. Talking to Eric, and he was very candid with me about how difficult it was for him. And of course, the Bond producers, I think taken aback by the different kind of sound they were getting. And so that was kind of interesting. I just loved spending an entire day with David Arnold, going through his Bonds one at a time. I mean, it was hours and hours and hours of tape. And he's one of the most delightful people that you ever want to meet. And we think we all owe David Arnold a huge debt because he took the John Barry style and updated it to what we needed for Bond in the 90s and early 2000s. And my hat is off to him in so many ways. Fascinating guy. And he really did it right for, 5 films, I guess.
Well, just unpacking that a little bit, just for a second, going backwards maybe on what you said. So starting with David Arnold, I think he's actually one of my favorites, personally speaking, and I think there's a real shame in Skyfall onwards that some of the motifs he came up with musically weren't really carried forward. Like there's things that he sort of devised for Casino, and they were in Quantum as well. That I don't really feel like you've seen them in Skyfall, Spectre, or No Time to Die. He had a signature for Daniel Craig that kind of got muddied.
Well, and this is the practical reality of how film
Mm.
scoring works in today's environment. Um, if you're hired to do a Bond score, as Tom Newman was, specifically because of his close relationship with Sam Mendes, with whom he'd been working for years, you're going to bring your own game to this storied franchise. Um, Adopt what's necessary, which is to a certain degree the style that John Barry created in the 60s, and certainly to a degree the James Bond theme, although depending on who you are and how it needed to be used, there are bits and pieces of it, or there are hints about it, that sort of thing. So uh, everybody brings their own game to these. I mean, Bill Conti, in For Your Eyes Only, wrote a very different score than we would have gotten from John Barry for that film.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Michael Kamen wanted to honor the Barry tradition, and yet he was his own man with his own huge hits in the 1980s, like Die Hard and Lethal Weapon. And so he's going to bring his action style to the film. Everybody does. And I think that there's very little, to be honest, I think there's very little thought given to what the previous composer had done.
And that is definitely a shame. I mean, some people will love the Tom Newman stuff, some people will take it. That is basically the way of all the scores, I would say. Some people love them, some people don't. And speaking of going back to Eric Serra, I think the only connection we have with that is we interviewed a chap called Jeff Kleeman earlier this year or end of last year, who was one of the producers for MGM. Working around the time of GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, and The World's Not Enough. He just talked a little bit about like hearing that Eric Serra score and be like, oh, we've got a problem here. Like we need to go and change some stuff. Like they did not react well at the top level to that, and that probably why Eric, from the impression I've got from interviews since, is probably a little bit sour on his experience with Bond, despite the fact having loved doing it. And personally speaking, I've got problems with some of the music in that film, but I think his style suits certain moments as well. Like I think it did work, but then you'd also go back to Leon the Professional a couple of years earlier, who, again, Eric Serra, same type of music, and I think it suits the film far better.
I guess I'd agree with that. I certainly would agree with the fact that some of the Serra score works and some of it doesn't particularly work. Certainly not as well as we were used to. It's interesting, to talk about the Bond franchise generally. This is unique in the history of motion pictures. There's never really been anything like it. And when Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman produced these now classic films in the 1960s, and lucky for them, John Barry came along right at the beginning and was willing to stick with these guys, particularly all through the 1960s. The films were unlike anything we'd ever seen, and as a result, John Barry had to come up with something that we hadn't heard before. And what's unique about the Bond scores, particularly those that launched the franchise, are that John essentially invented a new kind of action adventure scoring. We'd never heard anything like this before. It's partly pop, partly jazz, and partly orchestral. He starts out, so and John had an innate dramatic sense to know when he needed to be a little bit lighter in approach or when he needed to go hard on the action. I have to bring up the brand new edition of Goldfinger that's just come out on La La Land Records. And I would urge your listeners to track it down and get it if you can, because it's never sounded so good. And it's now, for the first time in any recorded medium, it's in the music is arranged in chronological order as that unfolded in the film.
Right.
The sound, I'm telling you, you can hear instruments you've never heard before. And in going back to do this, as I did the notes for the album, as you can imagine, I kept thinking, this is a masterpiece. This is the way Bond was intended to sound. And although John Barry had only been scoring movies for 4 years at that point, he came up with something that is so absolutely right and in every sense of the word that I remember saying to somebody not long ago, those late in the film, those two tracks, Dawn Raid on Fort Knox and the arrival of the bomb and countdown, as I'm sure you guys know, on side two of those LPs, man, has anybody ever come up with that level of excitement in a film score? It's just thrilling. And I say that now, even though we are 60 years removed from the debut of Goldfinger, it's just timeless to me and just thrilling.
Well, I think that probably leads me into one of the questions I alluded to earlier, and maybe something we've been exploring this week, although we've just been focusing on the main tracks, the title tracks of the films. What is it about the Bond scores, the Bond music, the title tracks that keeps people coming back? What's that sort of secret sauce to them? Because different composers, different takes, different genres, different eras, different decades, and yet we are all pulled back to this music. It's strange and in a good way.
Oh yeah. Another one of the things that I loved and I enjoyed tracing throughout my book was the fact that Bond, and this is true of the films as well as the music, Bond has to keep up with the times. So the James Bond, the Sean Connery films of the 60s, and were, of course, are very different than the Daniel Craig films of our era. But what's fascinating to me is if you trace the title tunes, the title tracks of all of these movies, they're kind of keeping up with what's going on in contemporary music. Mm-hmm. So Matt Monro for From Russia with Love is kind of middle of the road, 60s sort of crooner kind of sound. And then you sort of slowly move into the pop world with Tom Jones, with Thunderball, and then Nancy Sinatra with You Only Live Twice. And of course, Shirley Bassey with Goldfinger is in a class by herself. I mean, you can't even talk about her in anybody the other context. So you shift into the 70s, and you've got Paul McCartney and Carly Simon. And then you shift into the 80s, and you've got Duran Duran and Aha, and then eventually you wind up with Tina Turner. And of course, now in today's era, we have Adele and Billie Eilish. Isn't it fascinating how we have essentially kept up with the times, which keeps Bond interesting and fresh musically. At the same time, the Barry style of the 60s slowly sort of moved forward, and including Barry himself in the 70s and 80s. I mean, Moonraker is almost an elegant Bond score with those sort of rich orchestral sounds and the spatial stuff that he came up with for the explosive material in the last half hour. And then you move in, and even Barry moves into the electronic milieu with Music in the Living Daylights. So then you come up with the Arnold scores are total hybrids, which combine both electronics and traditional orchestra. So we're keeping up, and yet we're keeping fresh and original and moving forward. The Bond films are fascinating I think to unpack, because we've now got a 60+ year history of musical effectiveness.
Was there ever a point in the evolution where you feel like they just went wrong and they had to kind of course correct?
I think the obvious example of that is Eric Serra's score for GoldenEye. I think it was a wrong-headed choice. I think they were looking for something new, and you can't blame them for that. But I think that and there's another factor here involved that I don't know if you guys have discussed this in past podcasts or not, but you're talking here about a family business, which, in our era is run by the Broccoli's. And so they have a very strong opinion about everything. It's their show from start to finish. But when the studios got more involved with music making, this is toward the end of Cubby Broccoli's period as executive producer, and definitely in the post-Broccoli period of the 90s and 2000s, the studios took a much more heavier hand in the choice of artists and uh, and and then what kind of sound would be appropriate. I don't know what to this day. I'm not sure I remember even who made the final call on Eric Serra's um, engagement with Goldeneye, but it was I think wrongheaded ultimately, and I think they realized it fairly soon. But we're not, I think, in a position to just simply fire him and get somebody new, which of course is what happened on No Time to Die.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask about sort of changing preferences for you. Was there any that maybe initially you were really into and then turned, maybe away from, or the opposite that you didn't care for and then really grew to love?
It's funny. I tend not to shift my opinions too much as time goes on. I don't know why that is particularly. Maybe stuck in, old man stuck in his ways. But when I didn't like something, then I tend to still not like it much now. And to be perfectly candid, I'm not a big fan of the Gladys Knight vocal for License to Kill. I'm
Oh.
not a fan of that song particularly, although I can also tell you that I genuinely hate Another Way to Die, which is the Jack White song from Quantum of Solace. That just drove me over the edge. I think that's worse than Madonna's Die Another Day, and I had a lot of problems with that.
I have a question, and maybe you can answer this because I've always wondered about it. Um, Gladys Knight in License to Kill does not get a on-screen credit for her performance. Do you know why that is?
I do, it's interesting. I don't know in the sense that no one ever told me specifically point blank why that was, but I have theories. Um, the License to Kill is a unique situation in that they involved a music supervisor, which they had not done previous to that film. When Joel Sill came on board, he brought on Michael Kamen as the score composer, and he also brought in Nerida Michael Walden to write the title track and Diane Warren to write the end title track. He brought in all these people. To what degree, and it's really kind of shocking to go back and look at that main title and see that Gladys Knight, there's no mention of the title song performer while you're listening to Gladys Knight singing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that it certainly is contractual to a certain degree. Somehow the contracts didn't specify that Gladys Knight get main title credit. I think it's a kind of oversight. And uh, beyond that, I don't know that I could comment. I don't think it has anything to do with the quality of the track. I'm sure that it's something that happened contractually.
I've always been curious about that one, and it's always stuck out to me. Even as a kid, I was like, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, right.
And I do want to get back into like a bit more of the individual tracks and diving a little more into the granular, but a couple of things I wanted to talk about outside the realm of James Bond necessarily, but maybe influenced by John Barry, is what do you think John Barry's impact has been on the world of spy movie music? So outside of Bond necessarily.
I think the impact was huge, and any classic film score that went on to sort of iconic proportions over the years has as much to do with the popularity of the films themselves as it does with the contribution of music. I think that I think what we're talking about here is it's almost hard to remember now how big the Bond movies were in the 60s. They're big today, no doubt about it. But in the 1960s, when we had a lot less media than, of course, we do now, the arrival of a new Bond film was always something of a sensation. The after Sean left, following You Only Live Twice, the intensity of scrutiny about who the next James Bond would be was big. It was in the papers all the time. So what you've got here is John Barry's contribution to the Bond films, which you cannot possibly overestimate, um, spills over into action movies generally. But what I think you find is that, well, you particularly think about that bass line, that four note da 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 da, which almost has permeated, all of the music around us now for 60 years. I think that the minor key stuff of John Barry, the insistent, somewhat ominous bass line of the Bond scores has filtered out into other projects. But uh, Bond is its own thing. And I think that if you get too close to a Bond sound when you're doing another action film, it doesn't work right. It doesn't sound right. There's something wrong there. And also, you don't want to hint at something that's not unique to your film. So I think that John Barry's approach was noticed and applied, but perhaps in some subtle ways.
Hmm. And the Bond scores, like the musical identity of Bond, is so unbelievably strong. Everyone knows it. If you look at the history of, film franchises, it's like Star Wars, Bond are probably like the big two.
Yeah.
But when you look at 60s spy films, which ones picked up basically what Bond was doing and did it right? Maybe to a less popular degree, but nonetheless deserve recognition in that regard.
Well, the success of Goldfinger in '64, was so huge at the time. Um, not exactly coincidentally, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. came along at the right time there on television, and Ian Fleming was peripherally involved, in fact, in the creation of Uncle the year before, and so there was a kind of idea that, and everybody at the time said, "Oh well, this is James Bond being done for television." Well, it's not. It wasn't that. It was something different, and yet it is international espionage on a global scale with attractive, tough secret agents. Not as tough as Bond, but still. And so, and of course you've got Jerry Goldsmith doing that music, and yet Jerry was always reluctant to do what somebody else had done before. So his Man from U.N.C.L.E. theme combines militaristic flourishes with sort of jazzy trumpets on top, and that's a kind of style tip of the hat, I think, to what was happening on the big screen. And yet Mission Impossible doesn't sound really anything like Bond, So you've got Lalo Schifrin doing his own thing there, also for television. What's most fun for me is to listen to Jerry Goldsmith's scores for those Flint films, Our Man Flint and Like Flint, which again are sort of 65 and 67, I think, if I remember correctly. And
that sounds right.
And those are sort of buoyant, kind of fun, lively scores with lots of jazz soloists working behind the scenes. Jerry was very specific about everything he did, and I think that he knew that those scores had to be lighthearted, way more lighthearted than we were getting from Bond at the time. It's interesting that the lighthearted approach of the Flint films musically mirrors sort of the Roger Moore era in some sense, because things got a little bit lighter and a little bit more fun in the 70s when Roger took over as Bond. But that's just a couple of sort of things that come quickly to mind.
Well, it's interesting, like just observing the influence of non-Bond films on Bond as well. Conversely, I mean, you talk about the Flint films there. You see a volcano lair in Our Man Flint before you see it in You Only Live Twice.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah. Don't tell the Bond fans, because they'll just they'll tell you you're lying. But it was there first. But I suppose then, if we were to cast your mind back a little bit further, then before John Barry came and put his mark on spy cinema, we spoke about The Third Man earlier. Is there any other spy film scores that jump out to you pre-Bond?
I gave that a lot of thought when I was writing the book. I thought, okay, well, what are the precedents here? What had happened before in spy music, before we got to Dr. No in 1962? And the fact is, none of it's very interesting. You go back and look at espionage-themed movies, particularly of the 1950s, and I guarantee you, apart from the very unique approach of The Third Man, which I think is in 49, there's really almost nothing there that's worth talking about, that's worth listening to. It's one of the things that makes Bond so special, Bond scores so special, that where you want to go back and put on that LP or that CD again and again and again. Boy, I must have worn out that On Her Majesty's Secret Service LP in 69 and 70. I mean, I played that thing to death. I couldn't get enough. You can't say that about any spy music prior to 1960. You just can't. And so it's one of the things that makes this special. I think that, when you think about Hitchcock spy films, for example, in an earlier era, Hitchcock was never great at picking the right composer until Bernard Herrmann came along in 1955. Now, you might look at Herrmann's score for North by Northwest, which is a spy film.
That's what I was thinking about.
That's a great score.
Yep.
But it's way, way, way far afield from what we would get in James Bond. I actually don't think of them in the same way. North by Northwest is lighthearted but also very, very intense, particularly in the last half hour. And Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint as a couple, is she on the right side? Is she on the wrong side? Will they get together? What's going to happen? It's just not like Bond at all. So it's a special film, I think, that deserves its own discussion. But it's really not. I don't think that Bernard Herrmann thought of himself as writing a spy score.
Mm. Well, I think the jury is still out slightly on North by Northwest. We consider it to be a spy movie, but technically, Cary Grant isn't a spy. He's a man caught up in a spy story.
That is correct. Absolutely right. And a good point.
Yeah, and also with that film too, I mean, what is spy music before Bond? So, like, I don't even know that you would go into North by Northwest thinking, like, well, this has to be a spy-themed score, because what is that?
Yeah, exactly. And espionage, it tends to be dark. It tends to be orchestral. It tends to be, I think, sorry to say, not very memorable before we get to Bond.
Our job here on Spy Hards, apart from interviewing lovely people like yourself, is tracking the history of spy movies, going all the way back to the start, the silent era, and working to today, basically picking movies along the way. You'd be hard pressed to find a review that we've done pre-Bond where Cam and I talk about the score.
Yeah,
I'll
just say, and we've been doing this for 5 years, so yeah.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. I mean, I think that it's just not. Which it just brings us back to the notion that when Cubby and Harry launched the Bond films in the early 60s, they were onto something. And I don't even think they fully realized and grasped what it was going to become. But they were onto something that taking what Ian Fleming had created, but moving it into a hugely entertaining new medium. And there was nothing like it before the 60s. And also the other thing about spy films is that they tended to be extremely serious and grim in many ways. And, and how often do you want to take home a grim LP and put it on?
True. Very true.
Our listeners feel the same way.
Yeah. I was going to ask you talk about, how spy music can be playful. Your thoughts on the 67 Casino Royale score?
Let me tell you. There's one reason to watch Casino Royale 67, and his name is Burt Bacharach. I think that is Burt Bacharach's finest hour in the movies. And he did a lot of movie music particularly in the 60s and off and on in the 70s and 80s. This far and away is the greatest thing he ever did for the big screen. I love this score so much. I cannot begin to tell you. And I had the good fortune of going over to Sony, which used to be the Columbia studio, and going through Burt's original scores. I mean, I went page by page through his handwritten scores. You wouldn't believe the level of detail that he went into. He was very specific in terms of what he wanted and what that sound should be. And if you take the main theme, which you'll remember is played by Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass.
Oh,
and
yeah.
You combine that with The Look of Love, which he wrote with Hal David while he was over in London working on the film. It's magical in so many ways. I'm a huge fan of that score, and I could play that every week and be a happy man.
I'll always go to bat for the cinematography in that film as well. It's a Bat-esque looking film, but it's interesting. It's far more interesting to look at than some of the Bond films, the mainline, quote unquote, official, I will say.
And I want to suggest to your listeners, go back and look at that Richard Williams animated main title.
Mhm.
Holy cow, there's so much going on in that thing. I don't know how many times I've seen it, but every time I see it, I find something new. And I just want to sort of stop it every 2 seconds to see exactly what he's doing at any one moment. It's wild.
Well, it feels like it's inspired musically. Like it feels like they genuinely had ideas they want to pursue, which I wish was more the case in Never Say Never Again, which is another offshoot.
Boo! How dare you diss that film, Cam? Stop it.
Well, look, Never Say Never Again, as I'm sure you guys have been over a million times, is it sort of its own thing. You've got Kevin McClory, who's essentially remaking Thunderball, and you've got Connery, who comes back and does it for how many $1,000,000, and you've got interesting casting for the women and the villains, and I think we're at a loss about what to do musically, because they knew they could not utilize, not only would John Barry not do it, but they couldn't utilize the Bond theme in any way, shape, or form. So they had to move in somewhat of a different direction. So when they picked Legrand, he found that he couldn't turn it down, even though he was exhausted from an entire year of working on Yentl with Barbra Streisand. And so, but the challenge, I think, was too good for him to sort of turn down. I have a friend and colleague in Paris, who interviewed Michel at length in French about the entire process. And it was a huge help for me in writing the Never Say Never Again chapter. And Michel went into some detail, all of which I didn't put in the book, about what the whole process was like, and how he, I don't think he regretted taking it, but I think he was exhausted from Yentl and maybe didn't do the best job that he might have or could have. And by the way, I do like that song. I think the song is good.
Oh, wow. That's a hot take on this podcast.
I'll always remember when we interviewed Dick Clement and Ian LaFrennay, two of the writers on the film, and they were telling us about the original title sequence, and it was like a ticking clock and all this sort of stuff, and then they still had the cut of it, or maybe it was at the premiere, and they heard the Lani Hall song, and they were just flabbergasted by it, like what happened to their intro sequence. And I understand why they went with the Lani Hall song. I know the story behind why we ended up with that song, but I just wish someone had taken a step back and been like, "Is this the best option we have?"
Well, you're not wrong about that. I'm with all of you guys and many of your listeners in that I remember sitting in the theater in '83, sitting there watching it and thinking, "What the hell?" And then when I got home and I bought the single and I started to really listen to the tune and the lyrics, and I thought, I like this. This is good. It maybe isn't right for that sequence, which could certainly argue. But I do like the tune.
It's got a catchy hook in the chorus. You can say that much.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Red alert, Spyhards. We are shaking things up over on the Patreon page.
That's right, we are launching an exclusive new show where we tackle the exploits of the small screen's greatest secret agents, like Jack Bauer, George Smiley, and beyond.
And don't forget, every month you also get 2 Agents in the Field episodes where we decode the adventures of your favorite spy actors in their biggest non-spy movies. But Cam, tell the people what we have coming up next.
Scott, we are going to try something a little different on OSS this month. We are going to take on the first season of the Jodie Comer, Sandra Oh series, Killing Eve, which was created by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who of course co-wrote No Time to Die. Will this first season have us screaming, "Give us more," or will it kill our enthusiasm?
So strap on your Condor Man wings and soar into the future with us over at patreon.com/spyhards.
But before Big O zaps us with a red pulsating laser, let's get back to the Spy Jinx.
But I guess that kind of leads us over to a little bit of what we've been talking about this week, picking out some of our favorites of, well, ranking the Bond songs.
And I can't wait to hear your ranking.
Our opinion means absolutely nothing. We preface that at the start, because who are we? Just two guys who, you know, just like
Love this
music
stuff.
and love spy movies.
Yeah.
You're a man who loves music, loves spy movies, and is the official sort of man behind the music. You know this stuff. So I think your picks have a bit more weight than ours. So I'm going to throw you the first question. We won't go through all 27. We won't do that. But I maybe just talk a little bit about some of your favorites Bond songs and why.
You know, I don't know if you guys are aware of this. I'm guessing that because you're such fans, you've probably seen it. I don't know if it was maybe 15 years ago. A company came over from the UK and they made a 2-hour show called James Bond's Greatest Hits, I think it was called. And it was a 2-hour look at the entire process, but it was focused on the title songs. And I was happy to help them out. And I did a number of interviews with them. And then when I saw the show, I realized that this was a ranking thing. They were counting down to number one, which I find, I don't know, kind of lame. But
don't listen to our episode then. Whoopsie.
But
pull up.
But it got me thinking about this topic. If you had to rank them, how would you do that? And of course, I'm sure you've seen there are a million rankings all over the internet about all these things. So I've given it a lot of thought, and while I am reluctant to say this is better than this, because I know these composers, I know how they do their work, and every film is different and has different needs and requirements. And I also like the idea of songwriters working together to create something that maybe we hadn't heard before, or that's unique musically or lyrically, or is special in one way or another. I generally come back to 3 tunes, and it will not surprise you that they are all John Barry songs.
Mm-hmm.
I can't get enough of Diamonds Are Forever. I think that's an absolutely brilliant song, and with a particularly special lyric by Don Black, and of course with Shirley Bassey. I mean, who better? Who else? And while the movie is certainly not among our best Bond films, that title song is just exciting and so on point and so clever in so many ways. You know, I think John and Don were really, really at the peak of their powers back then. John had been working with Don Black since 1965's Thunderball. And they won an Oscar together for Born Free in 1966. And they continued to be very close friends. They did they did 3 musicals together, including the hugely popular Billy in 1974, which was a big hit on the West End. So John and Don were very much simpatico. So, and I'm just crazy about Diamonds. I'm as crazy about Goldfinger. And that's one of those instances where there's something special about the first instance where John Barry gets to write not only the score, but the title song. He enlists 2 good buddies, Anthony Newley and Leslie Bricusse, to come in and write those words. And I talked to Leslie Bricusse on several occasions. I'm sad to say he's passed now. We've lost him, but he was a really smart and clever guy, and said to me, I think I may have put this in the book, that he wished he could have written the lyrics to all the Bond songs because he was such a fan. He had all the Ian Fleming first editions on his shelf, and he was a big, big Bond fan. And then you add Shirley Bassey into that mix. You know, how can I phrase this other than to say, wow? You know, I mean, of course, and you know the great story about when they were recording the main title sequence for Goldfinger. Vic Flick, who was playing guitar on those first several films, told a memorable story about how Shirley was singing it, but she hadn't really sort of burst out into the kind of power she could. and they couldn't really see it very well. She was behind a screen over there, but at one point her brassiere came over the top of the screen, which was she was singing behind, and then she really let loose. And so there are great stories associated with Goldfinger, but that's a great theme. The third one that I would specify, in a completely different vein, is We Have All the Time in the World from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. That's a very special film. And John's idea, which again, it was in an era where there was no studio interference. This was United Artists. They didn't interfere. They released the films, but they didn't interfere creatively with what was going on. So John needed only to say to Cubby, I want to do something different here. I want to write a love theme for Bond and Tracy, but I want it to be sung by an older man who maybe is looking back on his life and thinking nostalgically about perhaps what might have been. And so you wind up with this great Hal David lyric, We Have All the Time in the World, which, as I'm sure you know, is actually drawn from the Fleming novel. Mm-hmm. And it was so special. And yet no one then was thinking, well, we can't get this on the radio. This will never be a hit. It didn't matter. It worked dramatically within the context of the film, and they'd had hits already with Goldfinger and Thunderball and You Only Live Twice. But in this case, Bond was about to fall in love, be married, and then endure the most unspeakable tragedy. And John Barry brought that home with We Have All the Time in the World. I'm getting choked up just thinking about it, because that's a really special moment in the entire history of Bond, that I think deserves to be, in the pantheon.
I think it's the most poignant of any of the Bond songs by a country mile, I'd probably say.
Yes.
But I have to jump in and just say you kind of let me down on the third pick, because it was Shirley Bassey. I was expecting Moonraker, and I was let down.
No, you weren't. All right.
Maybe the disco version.
And I have a great fondness for some of the pop people that came along in the interim and then afterwards. I love Nobody Does It Better from The Spy Who Loved Me. That's just a great song. And Marvin Hamlish and Carol Bayer Sager came up with, and I knew Marvin, and it's not an exaggeration to say you could sit Marvin down at a piano any time of the day or night, any day of the week, and he would come up with a memorable tune right in front of you, just like that. And great tunes fell out of his sleeves, and then he and Carol were an item at the time. And Carol came up with this great lyric, Nobody Does It Better. And so I love that song. I like For Your Eyes Only a lot. I thought that the original version of Tomorrow Never Dies, which was labeled Surrender, is a great Bond song that probably should have been used over the main title and not the end title of that film. The Sheryl Crow song, I think, simply doesn't measure up in terms of an understanding of what Bond needed. It's not bad. It's just, I think, not among the best. And I love Skyfall. I think Adele, I really pulled that one off in such a nice way.
You've actually sort of jumped ahead of a question. I'll throw it back to you in a second, Cam. But just we had a little extra at the end of the episode. We called it the KD Lang Award, for basically the songs that weren't to be. Obviously Surrender was at the end title, so she did get in the film, and but there are lots from Alice Cooper to
wait, stop right there.
Okay,
Alice Cooper thing needs to be completely debunked.
Okay,
Alice Cooper has been going around for years saying that he submitted his song for Live and Let, was it Live and Let Die? Oh, Man with the Golden Gun. Man with the Golden Gun. This is nonsense. Maybe he had written it and maybe he hoped that they would give it a chance. That was never going to happen. because John Barry was the music director of the Bond films. And if John agreed to do something, they weren't going to put a friggin' Alice Cooper song in there, particularly from Alice Cooper in that era when he was, biting the heads off chickens and stuff in his act. That was not going to happen. This is just nonsense. And, I have a section in the book that devoted to songs that were supposedly intended for Bond, but never had a chance to get in. Now, I must say, I did like the Radiohead thing, which I thought was quite good and maybe should have had more of a chance than it got. But I just, that Alice Cooper story just drives me.
The switch just went off on you there. We had to let you go for it because it's clearly something that's driven you mad since like 1974.
That's more.
I think, or something like that. Yeah, 74. Yeah, well, okay. So the award was for the best one that wasn't, in a sense. And I'm a big fan of Surrender. But have you got any you'd pick?
It's two more. I love Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which, as you probably know, was intended to be the title song of the main title song of Thunderball.
Yeah.
But the folks at United Artists said, we can't have a song called. We need a song called Thunderball. So if you listen to the score, much of the score for Thunderball is built on the melodic lines of what John wrote in Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. And I think that's a pretty good song, and deserved to be. I wish that they'd put it over the end titles, but beyond that, I don't know whether I can say this is my favorite, but I can tell you that I dearly love Only Myself to Blame, which Scott Walker sang and should have been the end title for The World Is Not Enough. But they decided that they didn't want to go out on that particular note, which was kind of maybe a more melancholy note. But I think Only Myself to Blame, which is a David Arnold song, is particularly with that Scott Walker vocal. It's on the album. Is great. I just love it.
I have to ask John, what are your thoughts on The Experience of Love?
Well, in case your listeners aren't aware, that's actually a song in Goldeneye. Well, I'll not talk about any other experience of love, but can I say I'm not crazy about it?
I don't think Eric is listening. I think Eric is probably passing on this
that's
episode,
right.
so
Yeah.
I think you're fine.
That's right. So not my favorite.
Well, I think then that kind of takes us over then to just the question of, we talked about your three favorites, the three least favorite Bond songs.
Well, I think I've kind of said that. Another Way to Die, I think, is a disaster of a Bond song. It was, as you may know or may not know, I do discuss this in the book. Amy Winehouse was supposed to be the singer of the Bond song in Quantum of Solace. Forgive me, Quantum of Solace.
You wish it was Silence when you listen to that song. Yeah.
And it didn't work out. Amy was in a very bad way in terms of her addictions at that point, and so it wasn't fated to be. And I think they let it go so long that they were in a bit of a panic by the time they needed to find somebody. And Jack White was a big Bond fan, had always expressed interest in doing something like this, so they went to him. And I just think it's a disaster. I hate that song. And so, as I said, I'm also not a big fan of License to Kill. Nerida Michael Walden and his collaborators, including Walter Afanasieff and one other guy. Anyway, some people, it was an attempt to go with contemporary hitmakers, and the idea to utilize someone who maybe was not maybe your first choice, but was an unusual choice and perhaps a potentially a potentially newsworthy choice to go with somebody like Gladys Knight. And I don't blame her, but I just don't think it's a particularly good song. I was livid with the Madonna song in Die Another Day, but then when we got to Quantum of Solace, I thought, well, gee, Madonna looks good by comparison with this thing. Um, I guess I guess those would probably be my least favorite songs, and maybe The Experience of Love.
Well, to me, it feels like, you're talking about your favorites, and it's that Connery / Lazenby era. It's the classic Bond era. And it seems like some of the other eras have struggled a little more. And I feel like the Daniel Craig one, Adele is fantastic. But when I look at the overall Daniel Craig era of music, it's really all over the place.
That's probably true, but that's because you have David Arnold and you have Tom Newman and then you have Hans Zimmer. And these guys are three very different composers who bring a different sensibility to each one of these. David did the first two Craigs, if I remember correctly, and I think the Casino Royale score is no small bit of brilliance. The way he deconstructed the Bond theme, hinted at it at different places at different times during the score, and then burst into the full Bond theme at the very end when he says that phrase. It's just thrilling. I mean, I just thought that was a masterpiece. And then there's a lot of really good material in Quantum of Solace too. And David got to work early on that one and had time to work out a lot of that music. So I think I play the Quantum of Solace album more than I play Casino Royale, in fact, because I really love the material, the melodic stuff that David brought to it. Then you've got Tom Newman doing Skyfall and Spectre. And, Tom's an interesting choice because he wasn't thought of as really an action movie writer. But he really buckled down, I think, and strove to come up with something that was worthy of the Bond franchise. And I think he did a great job. I like the Skyfall score a lot. So on Spectre, I think he was largely expected to repeat himself. And so it doesn't seem quite as special, I think, as it did in Skyfall. And then the issue with No Time to Die is that, they fired their first choice, or I should say the director's first choice, late in the game. And then because Barbara Broccoli had a relationship with Hans Zimmer from other projects, he gets the call, and it's fairly late in the game. He comes on board, locks in Billie Eilish and Phineas as the songwriter, and then goes to work with his partner Steve Mazzaro, and those two guys basically put that score together in record time because it needed a lot of music. And I think they felt that they needed to reach back to something like We Have All the Time in the World for a kind of nostalgic vibe. And then so it's just different scores. I think they all did their best. I think they tried to rise to the occasion. I think that the Arnold and Newman scores are probably more successful than the Zimmer score was for No Time to Die. But that's the nature of the game, really, particularly when you're under time pressure and you're trying to generate a lot of original material in a very short period of time.
It's also a certain recency, I think, with those scores. We've had years and years to reflect on Heimlich, Kamen, people like that, to reevaluate, reanalyze, whereas we've had a few spins of some of the more recent ones, or a few less spins than other ones, perhaps. And maybe in years to come, when we've got a new Bond who's 4 films in and we're criticizing that guy instead, we might be like, hey, that Thomas Newman, he had it going on.
It's one of the reasons that I want to go back and revisit the book and write new chapters on Spectre and No Time to Die. And I hope I get the opportunity to do it because I have a lot of material that I'd love to use. But also, a lot of things have come to pass since the paperback edition 10 years ago. And I want to drop little new nuggets all through bits of, yes, there it is. There's the paperback that you're holding up right now. There's lots of little bits and pieces that I've discovered that I want to add to earlier chapters, because it would be nice to be able to go out on a third edition that I could finally say is truly definitive and tells you everything you need to know about the creation of these often remarkable scores.
I would love to ask, when we're talking about these scores and songs, the underrated ones, the ones that maybe you don't mention on your favorites or your least favorites, but the ones you just feel like they were trying something interesting. Maybe it's not held up at the highest regard, but it's really worthy of more attention.
No, that's a challenging question. I'm not sure. There are moments that sort of stick out for me here and there. Uh, I I I've loved revisiting "Live and Let Die," for example. And in addition to that song, which was the first Bond song to actually be nominated for an Oscar, um,
Yeah.
and I have a great photograph of Paul and Linda McCartney sitting in the audience while you know a terrible singer and awful dancers are up on stage doing this wild dance to "Live and Let Die," and it's just horrible on the Academy Awards that year. Anyway, but I love George Martin's score for that. It was kind of raw in a way that we hadn't heard before. This was the first, the first film that anybody other than Barry had a hand in, and he came up with this sort of more raw rock version, I think, of the Bond theme, for example, that really works. Um, I'm a huge fan of the opening of The Spy Who Loved Me. What Hamlish does. Now, I know people think that the sort of disco beat is kind of dated, maybe it doesn't work anymore, but boy, that parachute coming down and the Union Jack opens up as we're about to, God, and you look at that and you think and you think, God, it's one of the most special openings of any Bond film, and what Hamlish does with the Bond theme just worked so well, I thought. So that's a special moment for me that I like to talk about. And Gee, what else? I do like the title song for "The World Is Not Enough." I
Yeah.
think it's here again. You got David Arnold, who has a strong um, uh, connection with the English pop world of today. And
Hmm.
he was the one who decided that Garbage was the right sound for this song. And to his great credit, he brings back Don Black, who hadn't written a Bond lyric, since The Man with the Golden Gun. And how wonderful is that? And Don's words incorporate bits and pieces of the journalism world and the newspaper world are in those lyrics, and so it relates directly to the plot. So yeah, that's just another spot. And I like that whole sequence, that whole motorboat sequence, which leads into that song, is great, I think. So there's so many sort of memorable musical moments for me throughout the franchise.
I want to spend another hour talking about Bond music with you, but I want to leave some stories in the book for people to go and pick up and have a read if they haven't got a copy of it already. So we'll leave some secrets on the table.
Thank you.
But what I will ask before we wrap us up is two questions. Firstly, we spoke about the Bond book. You've got several other books about film, TV scores, plenty to go and check out. We'll have a link to your website in the show notes below as well. People can go over there and find out more.
Oh, geez, I better update my website.
You'd better, but we've got time. It's okay. But could you give us a teaser? I mean, obviously, the idea of maybe updating the book is in conversation. But what else are you currently working on, and what could people expect to hear from you in the future? I mean, I know you had your Disney podcast, Fourscore, out. I think it was last year, I believe, or the year before. Am I getting my years wrong?
Yes, it ended last year with a John Williams interview.
There you go. That was right. Which again, I people should go and listen to. But what are you working on currently? What's coming down the pipeline?
Well, Dolby has now hired me to do a series of podcasts for them, and I started started last year with Oppenheimer, and we've just done a couple of new podcasts for this year, and I'll be doing some more for them all through the awards season. So we'll try to figure out who's going to be the most talked about composers for this year's Oscars. over the next 2 or 3 months. I have a new book out now called Dreamsville, which looks at, because this is Henry Mancini's centennial. Wouldn't it have been interesting to have a Henry Mancini score for a James Bond film? It never happened, but it's interesting to think that Mancini's theme for Peter Gunn might have been an early influence on John Barry when he came to arrange the Bond theme and then begin to work on the Bond scores. My book is called Dreamsville, and it looks at the early career of Henry Mancini, particularly at the time he was doing Peter Gunn, which was a private eye show that aired between 58 and 61 here in the States. Never, unfortunately, made it over to England. But that was the beginning of Mancini's entire career. It launched his relationship with Blake Edwards, which led to, the Pink Panther and Moon River and Days of Wine and Roses and all those other great 60s songs. So that was great fun for me to write last year. And I'm toying now with the idea of a book about film music in the 60s and how it began to change significantly from what had happened during the golden age of Hollywood. And that would include people like the ones we've been talking about: John Barry, Jerry Goldsmith, Lalo Schifrin, John Williams, that crowd of younger people who brought a fresh sound to the end of the studio system and the beginning of more interesting and adult kind of filmmaking. So I'm toying with that idea. I'd like to, because I knew all these guys, and in the case of Lalo, I know this guy, and have interviewed them quite often, and it might be fun to put all that to use in one more book.
I mean, you're teasing us there. Anything to talk about spy movies, not just Bond. I think it's a fun thing to do, and I think there is more to the world of spy movies than 007. So any chance to hear more about other spy movie universes out there, I'm all for it. So good to hear that's potentially in the works.
Great. Thank you so much.
And the last question, and this has been asked to every single person that's ever been on the show for an interview. No pressure. John, what is your favorite spy movie of all time?
I actually think about that kind of a lot. It's hard for me because I'm so deeply immersed in the world. It's hard for me to break away from Bond.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So if I was really to specify, the movies that I like the best, and I must say that I ricochet back and forth between them. I'm crazy about Goldfinger. I think Goldfinger is in so many ways flawless. I mean, it's genuinely the great Bond film of the 60s. But I'm also a huge fan of On Her Majesty's Secret Service for reasons that go beyond the fact that it doesn't have Sean Connery. The story is so well told. The score is not just compelling, it's groundbreaking in its use of the Moog synthesizer, which no studio film had done before 1969. So this is John Barry on the absolute cutting edge musically of what was happening in films. But that's a powerful film. And I to this day, I remember how I felt at the end of that movie. And I was just shattered. And I still have that feeling when I see the film. So while that may kind of date me, and not that I don't love Daniel Craig, who I think in many ways may be the greatest Bond of all, but I'm very, very fond of those two early editions.
There's no need to preface here. If you're a fan of that era, it's absolutely fine. We love films on the spy genre back in the 1920s, so it's all good here. I will press you though, because obviously you've got one foot in the Bond world, and as you said, it's hard to pull away from that. If I were to strip away the James Bond films and ask you that question again, so say we'll make it a top 3. We've got 2 Bond films there. What's your favorite spy movie that isn't a Bond film?
I wish I'd had some time to think about this before you simply sprung it on me.
Oh, that's no fun.
That's
no
the
fun.
magic.
We need you to struggle. Yeah.
We leave in all the pauses and everything, so everyone can hear you struggle at the end.
The sweat on the brow.
I'm no fan of the Matt Helm films. I just am not. I think the Flint films are a little dated now, although I am crazy about those. scores. I I have to say that I'm a big fan of 3 Days of the Condor, which is from one of my favorite 70s filmmakers, Sidney Pollack, and has Robert Redford, of course, and a great Dave Grusin score that I really love. And that's a movie that I've been meaning to revisit and been thinking about lately. So that was on the top of my mind.
I think he's getting a repackage next year for its 50th
Oh,
anniversary.
please. Oh, no.
that's
no,
awesome.
Don't do that. Oh.
It's just like a 4K upscaling kind of thing. No,
I
that's it.
thought you were talking about a reboot.
Oh no, I
Oh,
think
no.
no. They're doing one
Let's not do
for
that.
the Day of the Jackal at the moment. You're getting that on TV, but
No, please.
There was a Condor. There was a Condor TV show. It's just that no one knows it exists.
Really?
Yeah. It was called
forgot.
Condor.
oh
Was
yeah.
it terrible? Was it terrible?
I don't know. No one's ever seen it. It was on Crackle or something.
Oh,
I don't know.
okay. Right. Tubi. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Goldfinger, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and 3 Days of the Condor. If that's a list of greatest spy movies, I've not heard of one either. But I think that is a perfect list to have, and I think those are some perfect choices. Thank you, John.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be with you guys, and I just could do another hour with you guys. This is so much fun.
Well, you know, there's always time for a part 2. When this new book comes out, you have to stop by and tell us all about it.
But I'm dying to hear what your list is. Will that be soon?
That'll be out the same week as this. So listeners have already dived into that. They're already writing ragey emails to us about my poor choices and how high I put Never Say Never Again. No, I'm kidding. I didn't.
Oh, God. You guys are great. Thank you so much for today.
John, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Well, there you go, folks. That was our chat with Mr. Jon Burlingame. I want to thank John once again for taking the time to speak with us. Links can be found in the show notes below if you want to check out the book or anything else that John is up to. You can find out on his website. But Cam, what a week of celebration of 007 music.
Yeah, and I thought this was a really interesting companion to put next to our ranking episode, because obviously the rankings, it's our wacky opinions. It's us talking about what we like, what we don't like, and having fun with kind of the canon of Bond music. Whereas Jon Burlingame, this conversation gave us a lot more context into the evolution of the music, talked not just about the songs, but also about the scores at length, and also just was like a really interesting way to chart the evolution of a fascinating franchise.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a wide, expansive canvas of music, genre hopping over the 60 years. You know, it can be hard to rein in. And of course, as you said, we had our fun with ranking it before. But there are genuine stories and people's careers that were made through doing Bond films, specifically the music. And, you know, have gone on to win Academy Awards, all sorts of stuff. So there is a certain caliber of music behind these films, and it is good to celebrate it. And I think John is the perfect person to do that with.
Yeah, and there was 2 really fun little record settings going on here with the Alice Cooper song.
We all got told. We all know the truth now.
And also the one that I was really curious to hear the answer to, which was the Gladys Knight non-credit on License to Kill.
Yeah, I had never ever noticed that myself. You two were talking about that, and I'd never even noticed the lack of credit.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I brought it up before.
I ignore a lot of what you say.
That's true.
We haven't reviewed License to Kill before, though, to be fair.
I think we did it on another podcast. I think that's where I mentioned it.
I mean, it's not official Spy Hard's canon if it didn't happen on the show, so I'm pretending that didn't happen.
Sure. It's like memory beta.
Yeah, that's a very Star Trek reference for this James Bond podcast, Cam. I'm sure all 10 people that got that reference really enjoyed it.
Memory Alpha is the online encyclopedia for all things Star Trek.
Don't explain it. Oh, it's even worse.
Memory Beta is all the fan fiction and novels and comics and stuff.
But mostly filled in by Cam himself.
Mostly, yes.
I mean, I could pick apart the discussion and pick out some of the interesting highlights, but I think for me, one thing that really stood out overall is just how important John Barry continues to be, not only to the music of James Bond, but spy movie music and just film music. he clearly had an impact that you can still feel the waves of now.
Well, yeah, I mean, when it comes to the Bond franchise, they'll never escape, John Barry. Like, they will always be trying to pay, homage or kind of continue on the legacy of music that he created, beginning with Dr. No. And that's why when I was talking about, franchises with musical identities, Star Wars is the other big one. And the same can be said for John Williams. No matter what comes out, with the Star Wars name on it, there's always going to be that kind of callback to John Williams' work.
Yeah, you can't ignore where you came from, and I think it's important to acknowledge those sort of references. And I think one fear I do have, and just a slight bit of prognostication for the future of James Bond, is whatever happens next. I suspect they'll want to try and create a new identity for Bond in many ways. And I'm not going to get into the politics of who you cast or anything like that. I honestly, as long as it's a good story, I don't care that much. But like, I can see them wanting to do kind of what David Arnold had set out to do with Casino Royale by creating a unique sound with some references, but also trying to create his own path. And I can see them trying that again with whatever comes next.
Well, the thing is, they're going to be launching a new actor in the role, and they're going to want to have a recognizable musical element to sell, because you want something that feels comfortable and friendly. Although they did, obviously, as you said, veer away from that with Casino Royale, but I do think they'll probably go back to that more so. Like, they'll stick with a recognizable Bond musical identity, especially in the marketing for the new Bond.
Fair enough. But it's been a week of musical celebrations. We hope you've enjoyed both discussions. But Cam, the question goes to you, sir. What are we talking about next week?
Yes, we are going to be looking at a more modern comedy. We are going to look at 2012's This Means War, which is absolutely star-studded because it is a triple header featuring Chris Pine, Reese Witherspoon, and Tom Hardy.
Yeah, it's actually a spy movie I have a small connection with, which we'll get into next week. One I have actually seen, saw in theaters, no less. And it's a spy comedy. Always been a bit of a mixed bag for us, so we'll see where that goes. But your mission, folks, should you choose to accept it, is to join us next week as Cam and I fight over Reese Witherspoon as we take a look at 2012's This Means War. Now, if you like what you heard on the podcast, we say it every week, and we mean it. Join us over on the Patreon. That's an order, soldier. Patreon.com/spyhards. 100 plus bonus episodes available for you to get your beautiful little hands on right now and get it directly in your ears. And most importantly, you'll be helping us make these shows for free every week. I pointed out these will always remain free. There's just bonus stuff over there if you want some more Spy Hards, and every bit of money we get goes back into the show, and we thank all of our wonderful patrons that are already supporting us right now. And if you want to support us in other ways, you can find us over on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Instagram, X, Threads, TikTok, Semaphore, Smoke Signals. We're basically there. We're very lonely people.
The loneliest of people.
Yeah, we're constantly looking for love.
That's right.
But until next time, folks, Cam and I are setting course for France to track down Eric Serra so we can truly experience love.